Good morning. My name is Jody Smith and I'm the Director of Lands and Compliance for the Metro Flood Diversion Authority. I want to welcome you here this morning with us. I thank you for giving us your time. I know everyone's very busy. I'm hoping this morning goes as well as it did last night. There were a lot of great questions. Most of them obviously were directed to Alex to go over the crop insurance. I'm just going to give you a brief update of what we're going to cover. I'm going to give you a project update this morning just so you understand where the overall project is. We're going to have Eric come up here and speak to you where we're at with the flowage easements, and then Alex will go over crop insurance. We do have time reserved at the end for questions and answers, but please feel free to raise your hand, interrupt us as we go. We prefer to go off script and not necessarily use the PowerPoints in 4 font that Alex developed for you, but certainly we'll continue through this if that is the best way. So I'm sure you've all seen some of the construction activity occurring, particularly if you've driven up north and seen some of the diversion channel, but we also have a lot of construction that's starting in the southern embankment. So I'm going to show a brief video where one of our technical team members, Tom Fuchs, is narrating it. It's going to give you just an overall projection of where we're at.
Hi everyone, I'm Tom Fuchs, the Senior Construction Manager for the Metro Flood Diversion Authority. Notable progress was made again this past month along the southern embankment and the structures that will control water flows during times of extreme flooding. At the diversion inlet structure, 44 precast concrete bridge deck segments, which were fabricated in nearby Hawley, Minnesota, were installed atop the floodwall piers leading up to the abutments of the control structure's vehicle service bridge. Additional precast concrete bridge girders will be installed spanning across the control structure itself, providing access for Metro Flood Diversion Authority personnel during FM Area Diversion operations. Work is wrapping up on the upstream gauge well structure and has continued at the nearby control building, where the sidewalks and parking lot have taken shape. On the downstream end of the control structure, crews have also begun placing about 20,000 cubic yards of riprap, enough to fill a half-dozen Olympic-sized swimming pools. Over at the Red River structure, crews have completed structural excavation to a depth of nearly 50 feet below existing ground, where the deepest of the structure's footings will rest on driven H-pile foundations. Those foundations were delivered and stockpiled in recent weeks, and installation has now begun at the structure's base. Sheet pile walls will be installed to cut off seepage below the structure, while 87,000 lineal feet of H-pile will be used to anchor the Red River control structure itself. For perspective, that's 360 times more than the height of the North Dakota Capitol, the tallest building in the state. While Ames Construction is hard at work on the structures, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is marking completion of the first segment of the 20-mile-long southern embankment, SE1. Their contractor, HB Construction, has started work on the next stretch, reach SE2A, which is just east of the diversion inlet structure. This section will span another 2 miles north and east. Upon the embankment's full completion, it will hold back floodwaters upstream of the FM Metro during times of extreme flooding. I have a quick update on the I-29 road raise project for you this month too. Drivers in the area will be happy to know that the County Road 18 interchange has reopened. Crews have also poured the southbound Borrow Ditch bridge deck at the project site, a portion of more than 14,000 cubic yards of concrete to be installed on the I-29 project. If you would like more updates on our construction progress, just check out fmdiversion.gov or follow us on social media.
Okay, so then to kind of get into more of the southern embankment area, because most of our producers and landowners are really impacted in the upstream mitigation area. You know, if you look at SE1A, which is the first portion that construction started on, we are planning on wrapping that up still this calendar year. They're just doing some final work before we sign off. Then the Corps will hand over operations and maintenance of that to the Diversion Authority. For the top two, so the diversion inlet structure and the wild rice structure, both of those are scheduled to be completed next year, so in 2023, and then the I-29 grade raise will be completed in 2024. Everything else is just starting to pick up and construction's just starting on that, so we're still waiting for those contracts to go out and we don't have a final completion date scheduled, but it will be done before the project is operational. This slide just is a high-level overview of where we're at with our property acquisition necessary for the project. So within the construction footprint, which does include the channel, the southern embankment, everything that was necessary in both Fargo and Moorhead, and of course Oxbow and Drayton, we're at about 93% complete of all of our property acquisition. Then everything within the upstream mitigation area, including the Christine and Wolverton ring levees, we're at about 25% acquisition complete. So if you don't have any questions for me, then I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Eric Dodds. He's one of our lands managers here with the project. He's been working on, I think last night we're kind of guesstimating about a decade. So he has an extraordinary amount of knowledge and is just going to update you with where we're at.
Okay, thanks Jody, and thanks, good to see everybody here, some familiar faces. Again, my name is Eric Dodds. I'm a consultant working for the Diversion Authority, been working on the lands program for a little over a decade, I guess, and happy to be here tonight, or this morning I should say. I wanted to talk a little bit about flowage easements. Many of you might be familiar with this. The upstream mitigation area that Jody mentioned, and on those maps sitting below the TV over there have a bunch of colored zones. All of those zones collectively make up the upstream mitigation area. It's about 29,000 acres. It's an area where we need to buy flowage easements to safely operate the project. And those flowage easements include compensation to the property owners for the right to temporarily store floodwaters. We've been working at this for quite some time. The graphic here on the screen really starts in 2020, but in a few minutes here I'm going to turn it over to Alex Offerdahl with Watts. We first started having conversations with Alex back in 2014. Alex is a crop insurance development expert, and we recognize that the project will have impacts, of course, on farmers, producers in the area, and we recognize that crop insurance and farming is a key part of the economy in this area. And so crop insurance was one of the tools that we recognized needed to be advanced in our suite of mitigation offerings to impacted people. But flowage easements are also one of the primary mitigation tools, and so just this slide talks a little bit about the development of our flowage easement efforts. So starting in 2020, you'll notice there, and the font's a little bit small, but hopefully you're able to read. We did do a handful of studies, including some work from North Dakota State University. Their Ag Economy Department looked at the impacts of delayed planting and what the risks of operating the project might have on delayed planting in the upstream area. That was some pretty detailed research work. Alex and his team have been using that as they've advanced the crop insurance products. So those studies were done in 2020. In addition, in 2020, FEMA approved the hydraulic model for the project, which is called the Conditional Letter of Map Revision, or CLOMR, that basically helps define the exact boundaries of where those colors are on the map. And so we know exactly which producers, which farm fields are impacted, and which ones are not. Then in 2021, we've continued working with an appraisal company. Crown Appraisals was hired to put a value on all of the flowage easements on tillable farmland. And so they worked extensively throughout 2021. Many of you may have met with the appraisers from Crown. They completed that work towards the end of 21, and all of those appraisals were then approved by the acquiring agencies. So on the North Dakota side, it's the Cass County Joint Water Resource District. And here on the Minnesota side, Moorhead and Clay County have formed a Joint Powers Association. Those two groups approved the appraisals, and offers were made to property owners in the beginning of this year in 2022. Throughout this year, hopefully the landowners have had a chance to meet with your land agents. We've got a group of the land agents here. It's either all Lutherans sitting in the back row. So thanks for being here, and hopefully you've had a chance to meet with your land agent throughout the year. We've been continuing to negotiate and meet with property owners. As Jody mentioned earlier, we're about 25% complete with acquiring the flowage easements. We've heard some feedback from property owners and producers that you have questions about crop insurance, and so that's one of the primary reasons why we're here today. We want to share more information about the crop insurance offerings. My goal, and I think the goal of the Diversion Authority, is to acquire these flowage easements as quickly as we can. And to that point, we have a deadline. As you heard earlier, construction is progressing, the project is moving forward. We need to stay on schedule. And unfortunately, that means we're getting closer and closer to the end of our sort of negotiation window, and probably in the beginnings of next year, we're going to be asking to take some more aggressive steps in acquiring those flowage easements. I don't say that to be, to imply any threat or risk. I just want to be fully transparent in where we're at with the program and what our next steps intended to be. So that is something we do anticipate moving forward with. The next slide here just kind of recap a few items. So again, construction is ongoing. We have all the permits that are necessary for that construction to continue. Regarding flowage easements, property owners do receive payment when they've signed and closed on those agreements. And so we know the farm land prices have gone up recently, and we're aware of that, and we want to make sure we're compensating property owners and receive that payment at closing. All of the appraisal work that was done did a real thorough job of evaluating the value of the flowage easements, taking into account the depth and duration and frequency of estimated flooding on the impacted lands. We know that, again, land values have changed, and they probably continue to change. We're aware of that, and we've informed our land agents and armed them with the most recent sales information to hopefully reach a fair settlement and continue working with the property owners in that way. And again, time is of the essence here. Just last week, our counterparts on the North Dakota side did authorize sending out the first batch of last offers, and really sort of encourage those property owners to really reach a resolution here in the next month. And if we're not able to do that, then we will be taking steps to secure those easements through an eminent domain process. And so again, I know that's a little bit of a difficult message, but we do want to be transparent about that and share where we're at with things. So hopefully, I'm going to turn it over to Alex here in just a minute. Hopefully we're able to share information about crop insurance. I know there's some questions out there. I think we had a really good discussion last night. Lots of questions and answers. Alex is truly an expert in this area, and look forward to hearing him present. So, Alex?
So today we're going to talk about the crop insurance aspect of the program. As Eric mentioned, we were first engaged in 2014 when the original work by the folks at North Dakota State University was made available to us. And the NDSU study was basically a hydrology report. How often are we going to see events that might cause those gates to close? And when they do, how severe will those events be? Particularly, which acres will be affected and how badly will they be affected? That's partially a function of what time of year events were to occur, and it's also partially a function of just how big and severe those events are. All else equal, the closer you are to the control structures, the more likely it is that a flood event is going to affect your acreage. So we really think about the project and the terms under which we are to compensate the people that are affected in two parts. There's the flowage easement part, which is designed to help mitigate some of the effects on landowners, and then there's the crop insurance piece that's designed to help mitigate the effects on the people that are operating the agricultural lands in a given year. So today I'm going to talk about a couple of different things. I'm going to start with a discussion of crop insurance in general. One of the things that I need to start out with is an understanding that the folks in the Red River Valley, the farmers and ranchers in this area, are crop insurance experts. There's no question about that. You have the highest crop insurance participation rate in the country, and if you look beyond that, in the world. If you take the total number of acres in Minnesota and North Dakota, as reported by the National Ag Statistics Service, and then you compare that to the number of acres that are enrolled in crop insurance, the Red River Valley participates at about 106%, which I think, A, tells you that the NASS numbers aren't great, but B, it also tells you that every acre that's available for crop insurance is participating in crop insurance. You understand the value of this program. So when we're looking at mechanisms to try to compensate you as producers and to make sure that you had the sort of support structure you're looking for, crop insurance was a natural place to go because that is a comfortable base for most of you already. So this presentation is going to break a lot of rules in terms of what you should and should not do when you're talking to the public, because I'm going to go ahead and use some technical terms and some terms that fall deep within the weeds of crop insurance, because I know that this is a group that's comfortable with those. If I say something that doesn't make sense to you, or if you want to dig deeper, please don't hesitate to do that. I'll also tell you that we did a meeting in Hickson last night. It was a reasonably similar sized crowd, and I have about 35 slides to talk through with you. We got exactly 4 slides in based on the number of questions that we received. I hope that this is a conversation like that, where your questions are the center point here. I have some slides that I hope will help us get through some of the points that we want to make sure we cover, but you're not interrupting me. For goodness sake, your points are far more important than anything that I'm going to have to say today. And as long as we get your questions addressed, then we've had a successful conversation. So we're going to start with a discussion of the national situation, because what's going on with federal crop insurance is critical to the structures of how this mitigation project's compensation agreements, sort of a supplemental crop insurance policy, are going to operate for you. We're going to talk about the process of developing this contract that we're going to be offering you. Later today, we're going to have another of a series of focus group meetings with the producers in the area. We've got 6 or 8 producers who've been involved from the very beginning in drafting the language of this supplemental agreement, and they've provided some really high quality feedback. We're going to go through some more of that. I need to make it clear to you that at this point we are at a draft phase, and that we expect there to be additional iterations. I'm going to be very transparent. There are issues that have come up, points that have been made by producers that are still working their way into the agreement, and I expect that will continue. We do have a little bit of deadline pressure. This agreement is going to need to go into place and be effective for the 2027 crop year. And I know that feels like it's a long ways away, but by the time we look through all of the potential changes that could be affected, by the time we do some test runs on this thing and sort of make sure that it works in the way that we intended, 5 years is going to go pretty quickly. So with that, I will just sort of talk through these major points. But before I do, does this agenda make sense to you? Are there things you'd rather I talk about? This is your time, and I'm happy to talk about whatever interests you. All right, we'll start with this, but please don't hesitate to ask whatever questions you might have. So let's start with some context, and that is the national crop insurance picture. So this chart is designed to tell a couple of different stories. This is the total number of dollars of premium paid for federal crop insurance, and this tracks the last 30 years or so. As you can see, this program has absolutely exploded in overall size. 2022 was the biggest year in the history of crop insurance. It not only broke the record for participation, it broke the record by a record amount. There are a couple of things happening there. Prices are up, volatilities are up, those are pushing premiums up. But the other part of that is we're seeing producers buy higher levels of coverage. At the same time coverage is becoming more expensive, producers are investing more of their dollars into it. This tells us a couple of different things. First, it's that crop insurance is basically doing its job. And second, that we believe that producers are satisfied with what it is they're getting for their dollars. In fact, they're doubling down on it. If you've been watching the evolution of federal policy closely, and I know for the producers in the room, a lot of you have, over the course of the last 4 or 5 farm bills, we've seen a strong transition from direct payments or land retirement programs or conservation type entitlement programs to shifting those dollars to crop insurance as the base point of the safety net for agriculture. Last year, we spent more on crop insurance than we did on direct payments, disaster payments, and conservation payments combined. So at this point, when you think about agriculture policy on a federal level, what you're really talking about is mostly crop insurance. The other primary story that this graph is intended to tell is the level of support that's provided for crop insurance. So that lower purple area, those are dollars of federal subsidy. That is mostly our friends on the East and the West Coast contributing dollars into the middle part of the country in the form of making crop insurance more affordable for you. And as you can see, it's a lot of money. Last year it was over $10 billion invested by USDA to help make crop insurance more affordable for you. At the same time, the chart also shows the increasing out-of-pocket investment that producers are making in their own risk management. Producers invested a record amount last year, more than $7 billion out of their own pocket, to pay for crop insurance. If this was a program that didn't make sense for producers, they wouldn't be behaving in this way. I think that there's occasionally tendency in academic circles to guess that producers are sort of these hapless folks that deal with situations as they come up. But we don't see that in the behavior at all. What we see is good strategic thinking and producers making choices based on where they find value. So crop insurance looks to be a nice fit there. I want to talk a little bit about the context for why that might make sense. So the lower green line here is producer dollars paid in. That is your investment, and this is a national number. I've got some numbers for the 4 counties we're talking about here in just a minute, of the number of dollars that producers are paying in. The red line is indemnities. These are dollars paid back to producers for crop insurance payments. And again, these are national numbers, but anytime the red line is above the green line, producers were net better off by the difference. So look at the last 30 years. How often have producers paid more in, on average nationally, than they've received back in indemnities? It's been exactly 1 year in the last 30 where that's happened. That was 1994. That was after some of the flood events and the requirement for people to buy crop insurance, and the crop insurance they bought was mostly cat, and at that point, that wasn't a great value for them. Every year since then, producers have collected more in crop insurance indemnities on national average than they've paid in premiums. So it's been a good value. In fact, for every dollar that a farmer pays in, on average, they can expect about $2.12 back in indemnity. That's subsidy. So let's draw a little context for you. How many of you guys buy car insurance? Okay, that's fewer than I would have expected. We're in a courthouse. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and guess most of you are buying car insurance. All right, so for every dollar you pay in car insurance, how much can you expect back in indemnity? Anybody got a guess? National average is about 34 cents. So why is that? Well, it turns out most of the premium you pay for your car insurance is paying for flow, for advertising. It's hard to watch a sports event where 75 or 80% of the ads aren't for car insurance. It's because most of the premium you're paying is for advertising and marketing. Crop insurance works in an entirely different way. Instead, all of the marketing, all of the commissions that your agents earn, all of the operations expenses for the crop insurance companies are paid for directly by the federal government. So the premium that you pay is supposed to equate to the number of indemnity dollars that come back. But crop insurance sweetens the deal again and has taxpayer dollars subsidize the amount you're paying in. So again, the contrast is, unless you've got a meth problem or you're an 18-year-old boy with a red sports car, car insurance is a terrible investment. At the same time, crop insurance is designed to be a tremendous value for you because of the way the subsidy works, okay? So that's why you're buying it. I'll also point out for you that top line, it shows up purple on this monitor, it's blue on my screen, that's total premium dollars paid in. That is your dollars plus the subsidy dollars. Anytime the red line is below the purple line, crop insurance industry made money. They collected more in premiums in than they paid out. And you can see there are a lot of years where crop insurance has made money, and there are a few years where they haven't. 2012 is a great example of a year where crop insurance industry just absolutely took a bath. So the bottom line is this continues to provide a consistent value for producers on a national average. And as long as what we're talking about here looks like what we're seeing on a national level, then we're in great shape. Except that what we're talking about here doesn't look like what we see on a national level. Not at all. If we look at the last 30 years in the 4 counties where we've got the upstream mitigation project, you can see that you have consistently paid more in premium than you've collected in indemnity. So participation in crop insurance probably went straight to heck, right? The answer is no. You actually have a higher participation rate in these 4 counties than you've got in the surrounding states. The reason for that is that premium number there is total premium dollars, not producer premium dollars. Producers pay about 40% of that. So crop insurance has remained a solid value for them despite what you'd call a tremendous run of overall average good luck in the last few years. So this is that same chart we showed earlier on a national level, instead looking at the area where the diversion authority is affected. Now, the area we're talking about 30,000 acres, 29,000 acres, about 45 sections if you look at it that way. I can't get data for just those 45 sections. So instead I'm just looking at the whole counties. And clearly the upstream mitigation area is a really small subset, particularly if you talk about some of those southern counties that are just barely brushed by that area. But this chart tells a similar story. Over recent history, there have been years where you've had big losses. 2011 stands out, 2019 stands out as big loss years, but overall, this area has had a reasonably good run of agricultural luck over the years for which we have data available. Despite all of those changes, crop insurance participation has been very strong, and if anything, it's increased. So, it seems like crop insurance is the right place to start. So I told you that story to tell you this one. Where are we at with the crop insurance development process? Well, it all sort of backs up into the following conversations. We're going to talk about the overview and intent of the supplemental crop loss program. We're going to talk about things that federal crop insurance can do. And again, we were just talking about federal crop insurance for context, and things that federal crop insurance can't do. So we're going to spend some time talking about where those lines are. Then we're going to talk about, because you're crop insurance experts, how we build on what we know to try and make the program as easy as possible to implement and for you to understand. So, it all starts with the settlement agreement. And I will tell you, this is as far as I got last night in my slides based on questions. So again, I'll remind you, it's okay to ask questions or bring up whatever points you want. Or I can continue to yammer. I'm paid the same either way. Okay, we'll do it that way. That's just fine. We're going to talk about the settlement agreement. So all of the efforts that we're making in the crop insurance side are based around the agreement between the diversion authority and the upstream landowners, and there's 4 or 5 different entities that were involved in that. So here are the obligations that we've got laid out. The agreement itself, it's long, it's legalese, the print is very, very small. It's available on the website, and you're welcome to read that yourself, but I'm going to sum it up to just 3 primary points. We're responsible to compensate you up to 100% of the value of your crop for any growing season period losses. If you get the crop planted, we are responsible to compensate you up to 100% of the value of your crop. Now, I used a couple of terms there that need to be defined. 100% of the value of your crop is defined as the crop insurance price. That's the spring, or if you buy revenue protection, the greater of the spring or fall price. So, because your heads are bobbing, I'm going to guess that several of you notice or acknowledge what that means. But for those of you who don't, that means if you go to the Chicago Board of Trade and you look at the November soybean contract or the December corn contract, every day at settlement, that's 3 p.m. Central Time, we capture the price from the first day of February to the 28th day of February, except for leap years, 29th day of February. And the average of those, usually about 17 or 18 daily closes, becomes the spring price. We do the same thing in the month of October. We just wrapped up price discovery for harvest prices last week. So as a result, we've got those benchmark prices. One of the real challenges of trying to establish how much coverage we owe you is figuring out what your crop is worth. So we did the easy thing. We said, let's let crop insurance tell us what your crop is worth. We take the crop insurance projected price, or in the case of RP, the greater of the projected and harvest price. That's the value of your crop. The other thing we have to do is figure out how many bushels you are going to grow. And again, we did the easy thing. We went straight to your federal crop insurance rules. We said, what is your approved yield? So again, that's a technical term. And what you'd think that means is sort of the average of your recent history, the yields that you've grown in recent years. But that's not actually what approved yield means at all. It's based on that. But there are now 84 different ways that your history can be adjusted to get to a different number for your approved yield. For the most producers in the Red River Valley, your approved yield is about 8 or 9% greater than the average of your last 10 years. Trend adjusted plays a role in that, some substitutions, some other factors. Keep that in mind. This concept of the law allowing you to have a different approved yield than your history would have suggested, because we're going to talk about that in a minute when we get to requirement number 3. Okay? So you've got this approved yield based on your history, and we've got this price that's provided to us by crop insurance. That is the value of your crop. And our responsibility is, if you get these acres planted, to compensate you up to 100% of that value. So that is our definition of making you, putting you in a situation where you're fully compensated for growing season losses. The second thing we're obligated to do under the settlement agreement is pay you prevented plant losses. If the project operates and you find yourself in a prevented plant situation, we are responsible to pay you the same value on a per acre basis for your prevented plant losses that federal crop insurance would. Now I'm going to draw a hard line here because this is an important distinction. If you plant the crop, we're responsible for 100% of its value. If you are prevented from planting the crop, we're responsible for the same payment that crop insurance would make. That's important because that's a big distinction. So it's a strong incentive for you to plant, and that was an important part of the settlement agreement, okay? For the prevented plant, and I know that there are several of you wearing crop insurance caps out there, so I think you probably understand this pretty well, but for those of you who might not, the value for prevented plant is not necessarily the value of your crop. It is the value of your crop, your approved yield, times your price, multiplied by your coverage level that you buy for crop insurance. In this area, that's usually about 75 or 80%, and multiplied by a prevented plant factor. In this area, that's either 60 or 65%, depending on your choices. So as a result, your prevented plant payment is a little under half what you could expect if you actually managed to plant the acreage. That was really important to input suppliers, and it's an important distinction. We are not trying to create incentives for people to fail to plant if they can, okay? So this was a point that we got hung up on and spent some time with last night. You guys are nodding that either I'm going too deep in or you guys get it. So I'm going to move on.
So if we plant our crop and say we get 80% of our approved yield, the project was utilized in the spring, but what if we have our losses because of something else? Say a hailstorm or...
So it's a great question.
Did everyone we get paid, if the project is utilized in the spring, we get paid 100% regardless if we don't meet our approved yield?
Yes, and that includes if you plant late.
Correct.
So this is an important distinction. You've got a final planting date for your crops in this area. It's usually about June 1. If you plant late, there's some expectation that that late planting will cause a reduction in your final yield based on growing degree days, based on frost, other things. If the project is utilized and your crop is less than 100% of its expected value, we are responsible under the terms of the settlement agreement to pay you 100% of the value of the crop.
Alex, maybe
Please.
expand on that a little bit though, if I understood maybe the nuance of the question. So you plant late, things are below average, and then there's a hailstorm that wipes out some of the field.
Right.
How do you handle the multiple losses?
So that is a critical distinction. We're responsible to bring you up to 100% of the value of your crop, but any indemnities you receive from other sources get deducted from that amount. So
we will have a multi-peril policy on these fields.
Correct. That's actually a prerequisite for the settlement.
But they won't pay if the project is utilized. Is that
Close. They won't pay for any man-made causes of loss, any uninsurable causes of loss. So if you have a reduced yield, call it a hailstorm or whatever else, usually in this situation it's going to be late planting and thus reductions as a result of that. Loss adjuster will come out and say, okay, this is the portion of the losses that we're responsible for as federal crop insurance. These are hail or whatever it is that might have caused it. And any losses you had above and beyond that are uninsurable. And then we are responsible for bringing you up. So let's say you've got a total hail wipeout and the federal crop insurance comes out and said, okay, you bought 75% coverage, total hail wipeout. We're going to pay you your entire value up to that 75%. If the project operated, we're responsible for bringing you up to the remaining 25%.
okay? Now, devil's advocate, what if our losses are due to excess rain in the growing season? Is one insurance company going to point at the other and say, no, you're responsible? I mean, we've dealt with this with other claims, you know.
So the way that it operates is your insurance company's loss adjuster comes out and tells us what is insurable and what is not, and then we're responsible for paying the difference. So if your insurance company says this is entirely on the authority and all these losses are uninsurable, then we're responsible for paying you up to 100% of the value of your crop.
When you say we,
The Diversion Authority, I'm sorry, the royal we, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I just didn't know, is there like an underwriter that they're using?
So we're using the loss adjuster for your federal policy to make the determination. And then our calculation is very simple. What was the value of your crop? What check did you get from the other insurance company, if any? We apply that against the liability and you get paid the difference from the Diversion Authority funds. It's important to note that that doesn't necessarily mean it's coming out of the Diversion Authority's checkbook. It's our expectation that the Diversion Authority is going to buy an insurance policy for these 30,000 acres that's going to cover them so that if a big event does occur, they don't have to figure out and scramble to come up with $30 million.
Okay, one other question then. When the project is completed and there's not enough funding to pay for it, then the Diversion Authority can't buy that crop insurance or that insurance policy, then what happens?
So that question definitely falls outside my expertise, but I will also tell you that the legal settlement doesn't have a provision in it that releases our responsibilities based on a cash flow situation. But please go ahead.
Yeah, so there's maybe others here from the authority that can chime in as well. Question was sort of really related to ability to pay from the Diversion Authority standpoint. I guess maybe to share a few thoughts on that. You know, we're building a $3 billion project that's completely funded through a combination of multiple funding partners, the feds, the states, local sales taxes as well. There's an extremely comprehensive financial plan that's been developed to account for not only the construction, but also ongoing operations and maintenance. There's sales taxes that have been pledged by the voters for 50 some years, actually 60 years from now, roughly. In addition to that, there's other backstops that are in place. And so I think the bottom line I'm trying to share with you is that the modeling, the financial modeling that has been done has taken into account all of the costs, including operation maintenance costs, including the crop insurance costs. And we feel very confident that we have a system that will be able to fund all of these expenses. The other thing I would say, just for sort of context, the crop insurance programs we're talking about here, we studied this in 2020. Alex helped with this analysis. Based on 2020 crop prices, if there was a catastrophic loss of all crops in the entire 29,000 acre area, and if the Diversion Authority was responsible for 100% of all those losses, it would be a $16 to $17 million bill. A lot of money, right? But in context of a $3 billion project, don't mean to sound so glib, but $16 million is affordable. We could afford that, keeping in mind that event is very, very, very rare. For the entire 29,000 acres to be completely damaged in a summer flood event. We've never had a summer flood event that would have caused operation of the project. And so even operating the project in the summer is extremely rare. Having it wipe out 29,000 acres of growing crops is extremely, extremely rare. And so keeping all those things in mind, I think the more realistic chance for this project or this payment to operate, it'd be that late planting scenario where the project operates in the spring and it forces you to plant a week or 10 days or whatever it is later than you would have normally. And hopefully you're able to produce a good crop and not have a reduced yield. But I think that's probably on the margins of what we're talking about. And so that would be a much less bill to the Diversion Authority than the $17 million total bill. So hopefully that helps just kind of keep it in context a little bit.
Yeah, and under current prices, update to 2022, we're talking about a $23 million potential liability if the whole thing goes out. So we've got decent hydrology records on the Red River for about 140 years. And we're talking about 1 in 500, 1 in 600 year events. We don't have good data that goes 600 years, not for this part of the world at least. There was a time in the 1830s when the Mississippi River froze over at the port of New Orleans. We know there are things that have happened in this area that don't exist in our historical record. So we're making some guesses. We think they're pretty well informed guesses, but that's the baseline for some of the projections that we're making. So fortunately, based on sort of the nature of the agriculture in this area, we believe that the capacity to make indemnity payments is there. But let's talk about this late planting scenario because it's a critically important one. And here again, we're drawing a distinction between what your federal crop insurance will do and what we have to do. And that is if you plant in the late planting period, you've got a final planting date, and then crop insurance says you can plant in the next 20 days if you want to, but every day after that final planting date that you plant, we're going to reduce your guarantee. Our program is not. We're going to administer it based on your full approved yield. So if you plant 15 days late, we're all in the same boat hoping you got a heck of a crop or a late frost or whatever so that you're able to get through. And if you produce more than your value of your crop, approved yield times price, then we owe you nothing. But if, as a result of planting late, you have a reduction in your yield, we're responsible for all of those uninsured losses up to the full value of your crop. Yeah?
So if it's, say, close to July 1, and you're going out with plain broadcasting a crop, that's still going to qualify?
So there is a degree of reasonableness here. That's more than 20 days after your final plant date. So after 20 days after your final plant date, you are prevented planted, and we pay you the prevented plant amount. Yeah, I mean, again, what we don't want to do is subsidize ridiculous. Yeah.
Is the policy that you guys are handling, are we going to treat them like another AIP? Like, are we going to agree if it's practical to replant, or is it still just the call of the insurance company that's involved?
Absolutely. That is responsibility we don't want, and that is expertise we don't have. Your loss adjusters are the expertise there. We are going to utterly defer to their choices. Please.
You talked about the revenue policy.
Yeah.
Is this, what you're covering, is this a revenue policy? So like if the fall price goes down, are you covering the revenue loss portion?
So no, we don't consider, yes, but in a sense. Let me break the question down because there are three primary individual policies that are available. There's yield protection, there's revenue protection HPE, and there's revenue protection without it. And you've got it, can I guess you have an expertise in this?
A little bit.
A little bit? All right. So let me talk a little bit about that. We presume most of you are going to buy revenue protection. That means you're going to use the greater of the projected or harvest price for establishing the value of your crop, okay? If you bought an RP policy, we expect most of you will, then our prices will reset. If you buy a YP, we'll just use the spring price. If you use an RP, we'll just use the spring price, and then we'll value your final crop, same as your crop insurance company would, based on the harvest price.
So your coverage will be based off of the
Election,
policy
right,
on that crop by the producer?
but only the plan of insurance. We ignore your coverage level.
Absolutely, I understand that.
Yep,
Because there's some crops that are not allowed to have revenue.
absolutely. Sugar beets were a great example of that. Yes. And the reason for that, put very simply, is we have no mechanism for those crops of discovering a harvest price.
Do you have the language in the legal agreement on the policy side to address if the land gets re-rated by RMA?
So we don't care what rates RMA applies. We're charging zero premium.
No, he means if the land's rated.
So like a high risk?
Yes.
Oh, okay, we are getting into the weeds. Okay, go ahead, please ask the question again.
Do you have any language in your legal agreement to address if that land gets re-rated to a different rating than what it has right now, because it's in a floodplain?
So what you're concerned about is the producer's premiums are going to go up on their federal crop insurance policy as opposed to our compensation.
Yeah.
So as far as I can tell, and I read the settlement agreement again before I came out here, there's no language referring to any sort of change in the premiums due to producers. We do require that you participate in some form of federal crop insurance to be eligible for the agreement, because that's how we do our enrollment process and evaluation process, and we're trying to lean on those institutions. So if I'm understanding your question correctly, hit me back if I'm not. You're concerned about producers dropping crop insurance because they find themselves in a flood
No,
and their crop insurance rates go up.
I guess I'm more concerned about it costing them more than, because the land now is rated differently than it was when they initially were farming.
So I'm going to have to defer to a lawyer to interpret this for me, but the language does say that if, as a result of the project operation, your crop insurance premiums go up or your coverage available is reduced, that we're responsible for compensating you for that. Now, that is, I suppose, particularly designed around, is your APH taking a drag, or your approved production history taking a drag if you had a bad yield event for an uninsurable cause of loss. I don't know that there was any explicit reference to changes in premium rates for high-risk flood redefinitions. That's something that we can talk to the regional office about. I don't know what stance St. Paul might take on that, but I know that Billings has been pretty aggressive re-rating on floodplains. Go ahead.
I was just going to add, we have had some conversations with RMA office about re-rating the area, the upstream area. And again, those conversations were probably a couple years ago now, but they didn't anticipate that that would be something they would be expecting to do. In part, and again, history may be a good indicator of the future. We don't know how often the project will operate, how often it will flood in the future, but all the modeling today suggests that the project won't operate until we get to about a 20-year flood level. So rough statistics, you could assume once in 20 years the project might operate. And so if we have any operation of the project once in 20 years, that's likely not enough frequency to cause a re-rating of the area. Now again, if we find ourselves where it operates 10 out of 20 years in a row, I suppose there's a chance of that, but I guess that's not the expectation.
And it's worth noting that this acreage that we're talking about was fairly flood prone before we built the diversion authority, and a lot of that is already cooked into the sauce in terms of those premium rates. You're already paying a surcharge for farming in that low line.
I would argue against that because most of this land is never flooded.
Of the 29,000, and not to argue with you, but of the 29,000 acres, there's about 18,000 of that floods under a 100-year flood today. I think on the Minnesota side, you're right, there's a lot less.
Minnesota side, yeah, I mean.
You're right, most of the flooding is on the North Dakota.
I farm the Minnesota side,
Right.
and most of this land on the Minnesota side has never seen.
The natural floodplain does go to the west.
Aside from Oslo, that's really,
Right.
I mean, that's a bad area.
Yeah, Minnesota, more than 8 feet higher.
Yeah. The bank definitely goes the other way.
So you mentioned APHs. To me, weather is cyclical. I mean, I could see this happening 3 out of 5 years, and then maybe not for 15 years again. I don't know, but if it does happen 3 out of 5 years, it's going to really affect our APHs. How do we get compensated for that?
We are required under the settlement agreement to compensate you. And I'll tell you, the math for it sucks because there's a lot of moving parts there. First, your approved yield is pulled down,
Right.
so we have to compensate you for the increase in approved yield. Second, the rate formulas are all based on the relationship between your approved yield and the county benchmark. So at the same time, your guarantees are falling, your premiums are going up. The settlement agreement says that we have to bring you up to the same circumstance you would then have the project not operate. So trying to calculate that is difficult, and it's going to be an individual unit by unit, line by line calculation to make that work. That's the only way to do it. So instead, we're taking on what I think you could call a Hail Mary approach. And that is that we've provided some sample language to Senator Klobuchar, to Senator Hovind, going into the farm debate to omit any changes in the approved yield. They call it a yield exclusion for any years in which you had an event like this, so that your federal crop insurance will ignore these events, or effectively creating a blind spot in your APH in the year for that happening. Farm Bill debate probably kicks off into absolute overdrive on Wednesday, as soon as we figure out who's going to have gallons after the election. And when that occurs, it's very difficult to predict exactly what's going to come out, but we do know that the Farm Bill is due for renewal in 2023. And we do know that it's a priority, and it's very likely to be taken up as a priority in 2023, trying to get it resolved before the next presidential election, we expect there'll be more concerns about spending and budget going into the next presidential election than there's been in the last several years. And thus, there's strong motivation to get a farm bill done before they have to find religion on spending. They want to try and get that money spent before they have to decide how much they're responsibly able to spend. So we expect the farm bill to move fast, and we know that Hogan and Klobuchar both said that they'll take a good look at the language. They think there's a reasonable chance that gets included. If it doesn't, we're responsible for making those line-by-line calculations and making up to your no damage event. So, again, the exact specifics of how that gets done are mind-numbing and really complex, but that is a responsibility for the settlement agreement. There was another question.
In that scenario where you have 3 out of 5 years where there is a loss, and you said in your policy you have the math in there to compensate for that.
But I'm going to pause you. I don't have the math. I know that there is math and that we have to create it. It does not yet exist, and the rules for exactly what that looks like change almost every year. We're required to do it. How specifically it gets done is going to have to be a line-by-line calculation. But please go ahead.
Yeah, you use in that same scenario.
Yes,
Databases that we work with don't have a calculation like that.
You have histories.
We have history, right?
Right.
Any type of adjustment that's made on your end, I wouldn't think would show up in our databases.
No, that's exactly the point,
Yeah.
is that we have to treat you as if that damage event had never occurred. So we are spitballing on some ideas. Let me share a couple of them with you because you guys seem to follow this really well. So say you've got a 10-year history and then you absolutely have a terrible flood event and your yield in a given year is 30% of what you might have expected. We can go to the county and see what the county year was. That'll give us some measure of what's the general weather in that event. Then we can take your yield and we can index them and elevate it back up to the yield you might have expected had that not have occurred. Based on that, we can calculate what your approved yield would have been for those 10 years with all the other exclusions, calculate how much different your rate would have been, how much different your guarantee would have been, and offer you compensation based on that. We can't make your federal crop insurance policy be what it would have been. Instead, what we can do is offer you some cash to pay you for the difference. I don't know how else to say it. You're right. The math is really complicated because it goes to a unit level. Are you an enterprise? Are you an optional? The implications are important, not just for your subsidy, but also for your premiums. The math gets hard fast, and trying to explain it to a point where people are comfortable, yeah, what we did there was right or fair, there's a lot of choices you have to make along those roads. So instead, you can see why we tossed the Hail Mary and said, hey, Congress, develop another blind spot for these events so that we don't have to try and go through that process. I don't know if that works or not. It is possible, it's just hard.
Do you know if there's an avenue to create a map on these 29 sections or
Engineers love making maps.
Yeah, but I mean, that has, after March 15th, has the AIP's exposure in that map? Because about that time, we've started assigning, policies to assign risk.
You've got 40 days from March 15th till you have to make those
Yeah, so, I mean, if we had a map like that and we had a terribly wet spring or went into the fall with high river levels, that might be something that we could use to say, well, this guy, normally he doesn't have any losses, but he could really get flooded this year.
I can assure you that the AIPs that I've worked with are doing that already.
They may be, I don't know.
I see FMH on your shirt, and I can assure you that Shannon doesn't miss a trick as far as that's concerned.
Probably not.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. This is great. Go ahead, please. This is so much better than my slides.
Could you talk a little bit about the functionality? Say that you're required to pay something. So the AIP goes out and makes a determination. How do they go about filing a claim? Who do they talk to? Do you contact the insurance company to get the paperwork? Is the producer responsible for that? Or?
So there are several steps there, and some of these are under development, but I'll tell you what the concept is today. One of the prerequisites for this agreement, and this is, you can think of it a bit like a rider, it's another contract that will go along with federal crop insurance, is that you'd sign up for federal crop insurance and we use your acreage, your histories, et cetera, for establishing our liability. So the expectation is we've got 29,000 acres, and that might feel like a lot, but really that's essentially 4 or 5 big farms. As it turns out, it's about 60 chunks of small farms and landowners, whatever. It's not an intractable number of pieces of dirt. We know exactly where they are, and we've got legal descriptions for all of them. So our intention is to just go out and notify the agents that operate in this area and the AIPs that operate in this area, hey, if you've got these common land units, again, some of you that's going to mean something, some of you not. FSA and Farm Service Agency and the Risk Management Agency have this common land unit mapping mechanism. If you go and do your enrollment with the Farm Service Agency, you've probably been provided maps of your farm. And each of those patches of dirt is described in a legal sense, and then it also has this spatial value assigned to it. For every one of those that falls in that map region, we can tag and track back through FSA or through RMA who the producer who's operating it and who owns that dirt. Then we can communicate with RMA, who can link back through the AIPs to the agents to inform them. I know that feels like kind of the long way around, but under confidentiality rules, that is the way that we would have to approach it. Said very simply, working with the agents, we're going to ask that when you sign your crop insurance renewals, March 15th in this area predominantly, then you're going to also have available this agreement as well. You're going to have to sign this agreement, which is our agreement to compensate you if this operates at the same time you're doing your crop insurance, because we're going to depend on that for enrollment. If you have a claim, you file a claim with your federal crop insurance. When that claim is put through, we ask for a copy of that, and one of the things that's in our contract is that you're required to provide us a copy of whatever your claim settlement is with your federal crop insurance. Then we're responsible for compensating you up to 100% of the value of the crop, based on the information provided to you by your loss adjuster. And the last thing we want to do is jack what your loss adjuster says. They're going to determine their responsibilities, and we're responsible for the balance up to 100%. So I know we went super deep into the weeds there, but does that at least address your question?
Yep.
Okay. Whew, I don't know how to back up to the high level stuff at this point. Are there other good questions along this line? I know these chairs are a lot more comfortable than the ones we had in Hickson last night, but we are an hour deep now, so I'll keep going as long as you
Yeah,
can.
just one quick devil's advocate question, so to speak.
Devil is well advocated this
Yeah,
morning. All right.
Widespread flood event, and it covers dramatic portion, bigger portion of, say, the 29 sections you're talking about.
1994 on the North Dakota side.
Yeah, is there gonna, I mean, an event like that would create some inequities, so to speak, between the land that's covered by a supplemental policy and one that is not.
No doubt, because the area that falls outside is only going to be compensated up to their federal crop insurance, and we're going to make the difference. The other question that came out last night is, doesn't this give me a huge incentive to buy down my coverage level and let the authority do it? Now, I think if you know the flood is coming, that's absolutely right. But if you know the flood is coming, call me first, because I have some investment choices to make. So I don't imagine there will actually be much in the way of adjustments in coverage levels. It does create some inequities. The authority's responsibility is for these 29,000 acres. Yep.
In a given year that the diversion is utilized, let's say that it only covers 18,000 acres, and you've got, the other 10,000 acres is not flooded. Even though it went operational, are those 10,000 acres going to be compensated at the 100% level?
If they have losses, if they don't grow up to their guarantees, yes.
Say they're right at the guarantee.
So say so it's value of the crop, right? So if the gates close and you have less than 100% of the expected value of your crop, then the responsibility under the settlement agreement is for indemnification.
So you got the lottery ticket that year.
In a sense, yes, it's de-risked. And that's sort of above and beyond the technical mandate. If you didn't have a flood-based loss and prices went to hell for whatever reason, but the diversion authority does not make that distinction. It says that if you have less than value of your product when the project operates, we will take your value from your claim and will compensate you 100%. That's what the agreement says. It's basically a in-the-money put. Please.
So, based off of his question, the whole 29,000 acres don't need to be involved in this flood. 1 acre is involved in the flood and it kicks all 9 yards in, is what you just said?
Our responsibility starts when the gates close. And it's my understanding, and again, we can talk about the specifics, if your final value of your crop is less than the expected value of
That
your crop.
part I understand.
Yeah,
I'm
then we're
just wondering when it kicks in. Once the gates are closed,
Well, but sorry.
Please, no.
There would have to be a loss
that I
to
understand.
institute a claim, and then an insurance adjuster would help determine what was the cause of the loss. So I think what Alex's point is trying to say is that we're responsible once the gates operate, but there has to be a couple other triggers there first. It has to be a loss, it has to be.
And again, the loss is defined as relative to your original approved yield 10%. So your point is a fair one, and I think there will be additional discussion on this point, but the settlement agreement doesn't make provision for us to weasel out if there wasn't a flood loss. Okay, so I have used all of my time, but I haven't gotten through all of my slides. Are you interested in seeing the rest of them, or would you rather just go to Q&A sort of informally? Well, I built them. Heck, let's go. So I'm going to go much faster through these. That's not to say that I don't want your questions. That's the whole point of this. But I just want to talk to you about some of the other components of this. One of those distinctions is under the federal. Can you guys hear me okay if I'm not in front of the mic? The lectern sucks. But he can't. Okay. Have you got any of this audio? Okay, thank you. I'm a terrible mime, so I hope that some of that caught up. All right, so under the Federal Crop Insurance Act, uninsurable causes of loss aren't allowable. Anything that's a result of the diversion authority is going to be considered uninsurable causes of loss. We went way past that in this conversation. The concept here is to build on existing crop insurance structures. That's why we like having crop insurance policies in place. We're in the process of developing. Later this morning, we're going to have another focus group meeting and talk through with some producers what their expected implications here. So here are the pieces of the compensation agreement as it currently sits. We've been iterating on this, and at some point we hoped to post on the website a draft policy. I want to emphasize that it's going to be a draft policy or a draft contract if you prefer, because up to the point where we implement this thing in 2027, we expect it to change every year. The reason that it will change every year is the federal crop insurance policy changes every year. Our responsibilities to you do not. So we have to accommodate up against that federal policy. We have a couple of examples in the handouts. I'd encourage you to take those with you that walk through some loss adjustment scenarios, who's responsible for pay under what terms, and how we do those calculations. The loss adjustment manual is built around the idea of giving you predictability. We're going to run out a couple of scenarios and see just exactly what your payment would be. Later this morning when we meet with the focus group, there are a couple of questions that we're looking to focus on specifically, particularly defining what that gates were closed trigger in specific legal language. What constitutes a closure of the gates and what constitutes the end of a flooding event. Say you have a February event and all of the water recedes prior to what would be your typical planting period. Does that constitute an operation of the project from the issue of your ground? That's an important issue to settle, and one that we're going to need engineers and hydrologists to answer, because soft-headed economists don't have any idea what that actually implies for the dirt that you've got down here. So there are things that are to be determined at this point. We want to try and build on structures. You clearly really understand crop insurance well, so the idea is here to build on what you understand well. That information is my email and my personal cell number. I'll remind you, I live in the Mountain Time Zone. I'm always thrilled to talk to you, but sometimes my wife picks up before 6 a.m. Mountain Time, and she's growly. So I'd encourage you to call a little later in the day, accommodating the fact that the sun doesn't rise quite so early in the Mountain Time Zone as it does here. Please, questions?
Yeah, just kind of going off on your question, I think some of it might have been, this is only triggered, this supplemental crop insurance is only triggered if the diversion operates.
Correct.
And if the diversion operates and it's just 10 acres, 6,000 or whatever, if it only affects 10 acres, all of the acres under the diversion would be able to access this. But it's only triggered by if the diversion operates.
So the first one is very clear at this point. It's only triggered if the diversion operates. The second question of what acres would be affected is something of an open one, and we've had a couple of distinct questions on that, because we have to define what does the operation of the project mean, and is there such a thing as the project not affecting all of these acres? Is there such a thing as the project operating and it not affecting any acres? And those things are still questions to be determined. Critical questions. Our responsibility in the settlement agreement says that if the project operates, we're responsible to bring you up to 100%. But is it reasonable to conclude that if you're 6 miles from the nearest flooded acre, but you fall within the upstream mitigation area, that we should bring you to 100% if the prices go to hell? That's not a real reasonable conclusion. That is what the clean reading of the settlement agreement says. Yeah, please, Jody.
Can you touch upon when they would be able to receive payment, how quickly, and if they have choice of which fiscal year it is?
Yeah, this is a critical question. Most of the events that we found in the historical record are February, March, April. So most of these events are pretty early in the calendar year. Under federal crop insurance rules, most of the AIPs will work with you, most of the insurance companies, will work with you. There are too many acronyms in this, and allow you to choose to take indemnity in the current calendar year or in the following one, which is important for tax planning purposes, et cetera. It's our intent as an authority to extend that same flexibility to these compensation payments, where you could be taken in either calendar year as you see fit. The soonest you can expect to receive a payment is not less than 30 days after your final federal crop insurance is settled, because we need the data from your federal crop insurance settlement to pay you this stuff. But again, because it's early in the crop year, expect to get paid within a month of getting settlement of your crop insurance check. That doesn't mean that you actually receive payment from your crop insurance, but rather that you've got your loss settlement, so you know how much that payment will be, and then we can make the calculation. It's possible you could get paid by us before you actually take payment from the federal crop insurance policy, just based on whatever elections you make. So you can either probably expect to get paid sometime in May for typical events, or sometime in January if you choose to defer receipt of those dollars.
Can you talk a little bit about sugar beets? You haven't really talked much about that, and the stock penalty if the crop doesn't even get planted.
I can talk a very little bit about sugar beets, yes. So this question came up last night as well. So sugar beets have special rules and requirements that are imposed not by crop insurance or by any sort of federal rules, but instead by the co-ops. And we're not party to any agreement with the co-ops, but the landowners, typically the stock holders, would be those who own the land or at least who operate the land. And some of that does fall within the project. Because we're not party to any agreements with those groups, we've not anticipated any of those expectations. But I think if I'm going to try and, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so stop me if I'm going in a different direction. There are requirements in some of the contracts, Crystal, Southern Men, Michigan Sugar, Western Sugar, where you're required to plant some fraction, usually a large fraction, of the number of share acres that you have based on your ownership in those cooperatives. And if, as a result of the authority operating the project, and that dirt is underwater, then you're going to be unable to meet those obligations. Currently, there is nothing in our settlement agreement that references that in any way. It's a question that came up last night. It's a question that's coming up today. My answer is going to be the same today as it was last night. I don't know. It's not a problem we've solved for. We're going to need to talk to the sugar folks and understand exactly what those obligations are. It's not something that was anticipated in the settlement agreement. It doesn't mean that we can't work with the situation, but we don't have enough information now to do that. So again, to summarize my answer, I don't know, but I promise we will work on it. Other great questions like that? All right, well, I'm going to hang out if it's more comfortable for you guys to kind of come one-on-one or small groups. Also, if you prefer, email me a question, send it to one of these guys, or give me a call and we'll talk through this stuff.
I got one other comment.
Yeah.
This does not pertain to crop insurance, but I represent a local co-op in our area, which has probably, I would say, 30% of our customer bases in this footprint. there is nothing for loss of business set up for our co-op in this. And we've asked the questions and we get nothing. I mean, this would be really detrimental to our co-op if 30% of our.
So one of the other provisions in the settlement agreement is a business interruption insurance program, and CW Valley is explicitly identified in the settlement agreement as eligible for that business interruption insurance, as is Dakota
Floodplains.
Yes. So those two businesses are explicitly identified in the settlement agreement as being eligible for business interruption insurance because of the concern you guys have brought up. That is still under development. There's others that are working on it. They're not here today, but we can certainly follow up with you on the specifics of this business.
Okay, thank you.
So that's our show. Thanks for coming. There are lots of donuts left, and we'll hang out if you have additional